of Stagen. Am I saying that right? Stagen it is. Stagen Leadership, right? Academy, and the co-founder of Conscious Capitalism, Rand Stagen.
And I know, baby, just how you feel. You got to roll with the punches. Okay, thank you. It is great to be with you. I am the last keynote presentation before we move into an interactive panel, which I'm actually really looking forward to. One of my goals in where I'm positioned in today's program is to do my best to try to pull some of the themes or threads that we've heard from the kickoff this morning with Jay, all the way to what the other Jay just shared with us about B Corp and the movement that we're all a part of. So what I'm going to do is provide, as Jay did, just a quick context on conscious capitalism, and then I'm going to return back to this idea of the heroic spirit that we believe in the conscious capitalism movement resides in the heart and in the soul of conscious leaders. So today's program for me is really about bringing alive, that's my goal, this idea of consciousness in our leadership. Not our leadership as an abstract concept, but our leadership of everyone in this room, because I am operating off the assumption that everyone here is in a leadership role of some kind right now. You may be leading a department, you may be leading a company as a CEO, you may be leading in the community, you may be leading in your family. And if you realize that you're all leaders, you will realize the wake that you are leaving behind you, because you are likely having an impact in ways that you can't even imagine. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. So, conscious capitalism. Our purpose as a global nonprofit movement, we started in the United States. There's about 25, you can see some information about our organization in the catalog. There's about 25 chapters, city chapters in the US in 10 countries and growing very rapidly. Our purpose as a global movement is to elevate humanity through business. This is our goal, to elevate humanity through business. Ambitious, a reformation of the kind that Jay is talking about. And so I want to invite you to pay very close attention to the word elevate as I try to really bring that into focus for you. What does it mean to move up? What does it mean to evolve, to elevate at an individual level, at a team level, and at an organizational level? And so let's do a quick overview of what we call our 4 pillars of the ways that we believe this elevation can be operationalized and scaled. The first pillar in the conscious capitalism movement is the idea of higher purpose. We've all talked about that today. Most of us have come here with some direct experience with being in that conversation about bringing purpose to business. Jay just did a great job talking about that in the work that he and his team are doing. And then how that purpose expresses itself in relationship to an organization's stakeholders. I'm often observing that people say, what does that mean, stakeholder? What does it mean to be a stakeholder? And one way to think about this is, what are the entities? Who are the people, or what are the entities that have a stake in the success of an enterprise? Who has a stake in it? Well, employees have a stake because if the enterprise no longer exists, they lose their job. Customers have a stake in companies because how many people use Salesforce? Anyone use Salesforce? So I'm a Salesforce user in my organization, and we are very invested in Salesforce. We've spent a lot of money customizing and programming Salesforce. We are a stakeholder. We have a stake in their success. If they were to go out of business tomorrow, that would have huge negative implications on our business and businesses all across the world. So what are the stakeholders in your enterprise? And how do those stakeholders relate to and ultimately benefit from mutually the expression of your organization's purpose? Now we're going to get into a few more dimensions that are more abstract. This idea of conscious leadership. What is the consciousness of the leaders in your organization, the leaders in your community, the leaders in our country, the leaders in our world? The consciousness of leaders, and how the consciousness of leaders is, in our experience, the direct driver of the consciousness of a culture of a department, a culture of an organization, a culture of a community, of a country, of a planet. Where is culture ultimately flowing from? So give you, like Jay did, give you a few brands that you're familiar with. Whole Foods Container Store and Panera Bread, we would consider to be icons of the conscious capitalism movement. They are exemplars of what's possible by following these 4 pillars. We are very fortunate to have John Mackey, the founder of Whole Foods, and Kip Tyndall from Container Store, the founder of Container Store, on our founding board that I was a part of 12 years ago. And Ron Shaich is the founder of Panera Bread, and Ron is also on our board. All 3 of these CEOs remain on the board, John and Kip, 12 years later. So when I talk about some of the stories in the next few minutes, I'm going to do my best to draw upon my direct experience in conversations with these CEOs and CEOs that you're probably less familiar with. If you've heard of Interstate Batteries or First United or Studio Movie Girl, raise your hand if you've heard of any of these brands. That's exciting. Okay, so we are starting to cultivate in the conscious capitalism movement the next generation of conscious businesses. If you have an opportunity to read the Conscious Capitalism book that John Mackey and Raj Sisodia, another one of our board members, wrote, he also wrote Firms of Endearment, which was talked about earlier. And we see these companies emerging in the paperback version of conscious capitalism. Interstate, First United, which is Texas, First United's in Oklahoma, and Studio Mover Girls in Texas, they're mentioned in there, and there's a little bit of information if you're curious about what they're doing on the journey of conscious capitalism. And then finally, here in Kansas, next door, Bickford Senior Living, Slalom Consulting out of Seattle, and Satori Capital also in Dallas. And so these brands, and what I really want to emphasize, these brands are all being led by leaders who have a commitment to a set of principles and a commitment to an orientation of growth and change that is going to be the emphasis of what I talk about today. It's too easy to simply abstract logos and say that company, that business, and not recognize the relationship between the leaders and the teams and the cultures behind these great brands and these great businesses. So let's talk about that. I'm often asked, okay, Rand, you've been doing this work for 20 years helping organizations really develop these capacities to become the next generation, the next iteration of business. I don't even want to say conscious businesses or B Corp businesses. I simply want to acknowledge that we are at an inflection point where there is an evolution of business to a different form. And people will say, what is the unlocking move? If you had to just really distill it down to one big, Jay started out this morning with this idea of leverage. What's the one big lever for building a business like the brands you just saw in both Jay's presentation and my presentation? And I will say in one slide, I can summarize this question. What's the unlocking move? Going upstream, which Don talked about, I love the fact that he used that metaphor. Using the metaphor of upstream suggests what's the source? If we want to find the source of something, we're going to look at the company. We're going to look at Interstate Batteries. We're going to look at Panera Bread. And we're going to ask ourselves, well, what creates that kind of company? And I would propose that what creates that kind of organization is a culture. That is the driver behind that company. But the more important question is what creates that culture? And as I have just said, in our experience, the human beings leading organizations are the root cause, the source that drives the culture, that drives the company. So I will be approached, my faculty in Dallas, we have a training facility in Dallas, our leadership academy, so we have the opportunity to interact with a lot of people all over the United States, a lot of CEOs, which is our primary focus. And the CEOs that we will initially meet will say things sort of like this. I want to change my company. I want my company to be different. And then we'll say, well, tell us a little bit about what's going on with your company. And they'll start to complain about their frustrations. And the CEO will say, let's say it's a mid-sized business here in the Midwest. Maybe it's a $50 or $100 million business, 300-400 employees. And we'll say, so tell us about what's going on in your situation. And the CEO will complain. And the CEO will start to say, my team's not working well together. We're not collaborating. There isn't trust. We're not doing well in our surveys. We've done a Gallup survey, and we're not doing well there. And we'll listen to the energy and the passion of complaint. And then we'll say, well, you're saying that you've got problems with your CFO and you've got problems with your head of sales, you've got problems with your head of operations. Who hired those 3 people? And then it'll be silence. And the CEO will pause and say, well, I hired those people. And then we'll say, so is it possible that the very thing that you're complaining about is actually an opportunity for you to take responsibility and look in the mirror that all of these complaints that are going on in your organization are nothing more than feedback for you? What a gift. They don't necessarily see it as a gift, but what a gift. The spiritual practice of leadership. I believe that leaders have the incredible gift of being in a feedback-rich environment. They're constantly in positions where they can take that feedback and they can use it to grow and adapt and evolve. So it's all about leadership. And in our 20 years, our summary, our thematic big statement is the following, which leaders, by the way, often also do not like actually hearing us say. And it's a single statement. Leaders get the organization they deserve. Leaders get the organization they deserve. There it is. There's our summary. Where is the root of creating a great, amazing, next level business, a conscious business? We would suggest it resides with the leader. And the lever in this suggests we don't need to hire organizational consultants, and we don't need to try to outsource this because companies don't change, people do. And I want to say this again, companies don't change, people do. I had an invitation from a friend of mine who is involved in a large Fortune 500 public company at the C-suite as an advisor. And he said, will you do me a favor and meet with the CEO and the executive team of this company to talk about becoming a purpose-based, values-based, conscious business. And what they had told me is that there had been some complaints from employees and there were some early indications that they were not adapting with the marketplace. And I said, I don't necessarily feel like they're going to want to spend time with me because there's a orientation I have that transparency and challenge is what especially the most powerful leaders need because they don't get enough of it. There's an Oscar Wilde quote, true friends stab you in the front. Okay? True friends stab you in the front. And so I have a reputation of being incredibly friendly with CEOs. Okay? And I'm like, I want to bring the benefit of feedback for you. And so we spent dinner together with his 8 executives. I got on an airplane, I flew there, doing this as a favor, had no agenda, wasn't trying to sell anything, wasn't trying to achieve anything, which gave me great freedom. And then the next day after dinner, we had a little bit of rapport built. We spent about 7 hours, and they began to tell me about what they're doing to become a conscious business. And they had sent their head of HR, who was in the room, out to visit Chick-fil-A and to visit Southwest Airlines and to go and visit other companies to learn about this. They had spent all of this money on all of these research studies. They had done a tremendous amount of good work at the HR and training and organizational development levels. And one of those executives was represented on the C-suite. In the entire meeting, we talked about what they wanted to change. And during the meeting, I watched the relational dynamics between the CEO, a very powerful alpha, very incredibly successful and bright person. I watched the dynamics between him and his executive team. And I saw how people were shut down. I saw how people were not honest. I saw how people weren't collaborative. I saw a transactional dance. That's what I witnessed. And during the meeting, they were telling me how they wanted to create the opposite, relationship, not transaction. At the end of the meeting, I asked if I could have a 1-hour wrap with the CEO. And it only lasted 30 minutes because he didn't want to do the full hour. And I basically said, this is about you. And I gave him feedback on how I experienced him in the meeting. He did not receive that feedback well. And I said, this is about you. What an amazing opportunity. You have over 10,000 employees in your responsibility. You're stewarding this. And if you change, you can create a transformation in yourself that can be extended to your executive team, and the executive team can extend that down to the VPs, down to the directors, down to the managers, and it can cascade through time, all the way through the organization. And he said, Rand, you don't understand. I don't have time to work on myself. That's why you're here. I want you and your team to go in and do this work. And I looked at him and I said, you're not going to get any stronger watching me do push-ups. Okay? You're not going to get any stronger watching me do push-ups. You can't outsource this. This is your work to do. And I want to be really clear. This is your work to do, I said. And he thought that I was doing some kind of a sales takeaway where you say, I don't want your business, then you pull it away, and then he says, come back, and we had this fascinating dance. And I said, this is not a theatrical frame. I said, I genuinely believe that you could unleash in yourself something extraordinary, but you've got to do your work. And I said, I actually would like to introduce you to someone, not even in my organization, someone who might be a better specialist on experience. And I have the name of some people that I'm happy to introduce you to if you're interested. No interest, no follow-up, no call, because he has been conditioned to become a high-level leader in a large global organization. As men and women move up to the top, they move up to the top, which is a positive, because they have learned to outsource and delegate almost everything. Does this make sense? You learn to outsource and delegate almost everything. But then the delusion comes online when many of these leaders, not all, get to the top that, well, I should be able to outsource my own development. Right? I should be able to have somebody else do my work for me. And in our experience, we've actually never seen that done. I have a quick story that may bring this to life. I was giving a speech. A gentleman came up after the speech and he said, can I talk to you? And I said, yes. And it was sort of about this theme of personal responsibility. And he said, about 10 years ago, my wife and I were having some pretty significant marital problems. And this was a stranger, and I'm listening to this. And he says, you know, as a high-powered executive, I know how to get the best resources that money can buy. And he was very good at outsourcing and delegating. And he said, I found, through my network, the best marriage counselor, bar none, best marriage counselor by reputation and by cost in my market. And I said, great. And I'm waiting for the story. And I said, what happened? And he said, I sent my wife to the counselor. The true story. True story. I sent my wife to the counselor. I give you that because I want you to understand and even empathize with what it's like to be in a position of power and influence where you start to lose perspective. It just sort of disappears through time, and you don't necessarily, if you're that kind of leader, have the benefit of the straight talk that I think we all need from our colleagues, our friends, our family, the straight talk. And so then he said, but Rand, and he got very, his face softened and he got really sweet, and he said, but Rand, when I started to go to the marriage counselor with her, because it didn't work the first 4 or 5 visits by herself. He said, when I started to go with her, we started to have a transformation in our relationship because he was part of the problem. Therefore, he needed to participate directly in being part of the solution. And so what I'm asserting is leaders need to do more than be executive sponsors of B Corp and conscious capitalism and inclusive capitalism and all the other wonderful fellow travelers that are out there. They need to be, CEOs and boards need to be directly involved in this change. And in the interdependence document from B Corp, the Declaration of Interdependence, there's a line in there, be the change. And we need to be the change, not just CEOs, but all of us. So there's something that our team of psychologists working with a real commitment to try to understand, why is it that leaders get stuck? And we have a concept here we call the performance paradox. And the performance paradox uses the metaphor of golf. And it basically says if an amateur golfer develops a winning formula, a swing, to go from amateur to the professional level, we can all appreciate that they would be very committed to that winning formula. What did they use? What was their approach to become one of the best in the world if they're a professional? And the reason it's called paradox is that the winning formula, or the swing, that an athlete uses to go from one level to the next will paradoxically ultimately become the very swing or winning formula that will hold them back from going to their next level. Said another way, a book Marshall Goldsmith wrote, what got you here won't get you there. So at a very, very deep level, most leaders that we interact with that have a genuine and sincere aspiration to change find themselves stuck because they're so identified with how they win today. The idea of getting beyond that is actually incredibly frightening and requires something that Jay also mentioned, courage. Do you have the courage to change, leaders? Can you actually be willing to put yourself in a position like a golfer who goes up to a high level and then retools his or her swing? And what we know when we watch athletes do this is they actually go back in performance for a period of time as they're reimagining and retooling their body and their approach. And then in many cases, but not all, they can then have an accelerant beyond any level they've ever been at. So the performance paradox really points to something that conscious capitalism likes to say, that conscious leadership is an inside job. Okay, this is about the inner work of a leader to the next level. Inner work, psychological work, emotional work, spiritual work for some people. I use the word spiritual. You opened the door up on that one, Don. And spiritual meaning this idea of, am I a part of something bigger than myself? Right? What am I a part of? The topic of purpose and meaning would fall for me under that category. So what's on the inside? I can only pick with my time today, and I built this with Graham's coaching and encouragement. I built out a presentation to really get at two dimensions of the inner work. And these two dimensions have been talked about several times today. And the first one is the sphere of concern, moving from a conventional capacity to a conscious capacity. Remember elevating to elevate? And so I'm going to use conventional to conscious. And the dimension is sphere of concern, from a shareholder orientation for what I care about, what I'm concerned about, to a stakeholder orientation. And we're going to talk about time horizon in a very unique way that I imagine very, very few people in this room will probably have thought about what I'm going to put forth as a provocative thesis for understanding why it's so difficult for leaders today to move out of short-termism, good people, to move out of short-termism into a more long-term view. And I'm going to talk about it at a capacity level, not simply a decision or a choice to become more long-term. So let's dive in quickly on both of these to the sphere of concern. Love this idea. Tell me what you care about, and I will tell you how big you are. Tell me what you care about, and I will tell you how big you are. We want to invite leaders into our movements who are ready to play big and are ready to care big. And so now let's take a developmental approach to this, which comes from decades of research, from multiple studies, from Boston College to Harvard to other places. I'm oversimplified on this slide. But there is this idea that there's me, and that's my sphere of concern, just me, which we all are as children, egocentric. And then as we grow into adulthood, for not everyone, but for most of us, we actually see our friends and our peers move from a sphere of concern, what Stephen Covey used to call circle of concern, a sphere of concern from me to us, from me to us. And developmentally, that is a move from egocentric to ethnocentric. And then it moves from me to us to all of us. And now we've moved from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric. I give you these academic terms because I want you to understand there's a grounding in this. And what I'm going to put forth is that the move from a shareholder sphere of concern is actually, I assert, the move from us to a stakeholder orientation to all of us. And the reason I'm grounding this in the idea of development is that I believe, and our organization believes, and we're working hard as learners around this every day with our hundreds of organizations and thousands of leaders that we're working with at any given year. And what we're trying to understand is how stakeholder orientation is not simply a decision. That stakeholder orientation requires the people who are the stakeholders, especially the boards and the CEOs of businesses, to have the capacity to actually care about more than us, and in a shareholder orientation, a way to think about us is I'm the CEO, and you're the board, and you're the investors. That's us. It's me and the board and the investors, and the board is investors, so it's sort of shareholder primacy. It's me and the shareholders. That's us. And then we're now being provoked into this question of, can we go to a stakeholder orientation where it's not just me and the shareholders and the board cozy. Now all of a sudden it's a move to all of us where we start to think about all the stakeholders. Said again, I'm going to repeat this, I would encourage you to consider the possibility that this is much more than just a decision because Larry Fink sends a letter and I love his letters. But this is going to take time to develop the capacity in our leaders. The next one is definitely a little bit provocative, and I'm going to end with this one. The short term to long term. I had the opportunity to speak about this Bill Gates quote in an article I'm going to show you a picture of. Most people overestimate what they can do in 1 year and underestimate what they can do in 10 years. This is a profoundly, I'm going to pause here, a profoundly important idea. That we vastly underestimate as leaders what's possible if we can actually think about our game that we're playing in business and in life in more of a decading view versus a quarterly view or an annual view. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested in what I'm about to share with you, because the research is grounded in this article. You might want to take a picture of this, because I'm going to show you one slide that is something that some people want to go back to and say, I don't believe what he just shared with me. And so the future of finance was the issue in Conscious Company magazine last summer. And the article that I had the opportunity to write is a call for long-term capitalism. And in this article, I referenced the McKinsey study that was a 15-year study on Corporate Horizon Index. And what they did, I'm not going to go through the details here, but just look at these 5 metrics. They looked at investment, earnings quality, margin growth, quarterly management, and earnings per share growth. They come up with a very credible, data-driven way of assessing over 15 years whether leaders at the top of public companies made decisions on an annual basis oriented from a short-term view in the way in which they financially engineered their earnings, or a long-term view. And they looked at whether investments were being made in the long term. It's a very robust study, and I would encourage anyone who's interested in the financial part of investment to look at this. And what they found, no surprise, is that across earnings, revenue, or market cap over these 15 years, the management teams, the CEOs and leadership teams that operated with long-term decision-making made significantly more money for the shareholders through time. So the long-term game doesn't need any more letters from Larry Fink or McKinsey studies. The case for long-termism, I assert, has been made. There's no more real criticism of it. Then the question, why aren't we seeing more organizations adopt it? This is a visual that was rendered by Dr. Barrett Brown. Barrett wrote an article for the Conscious Capitalism community back in 2015. This article was based on a dissertation that he did trying to understand the relationship between leadership development vertically, remember, elevating humanity, sometimes called at the Harvard, Bob Keegan, who ran for 40 years the adult psychology department at Harvard, calls this move from one level to the next consciousness complexity, an ever-growing complexity in consciousness. And what Barrett wanted to understand is the relationship between higher order leadership capacity and the ability to implement sustained organizational change. What's the relationship between leadership capacity, higher levels, and organizational change efforts? And this is based in tremendous research that he drew upon, which some of you may want to go look at. I know we've got some academics in the audience. So conventional leaders, the data shows, and we're going to arbitrarily use these levels of 1 through 4, actually represent 85% of leaders in the market today. 85% of leaders are accessing conventional leadership capability or capacity, and this is the fascinating part of the research. The capacity, not to intellectualize it, but to actually embody and then lead with time is up to 5 years, 3 to 5 years. CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, brilliant people, have a limit, the research shows, on their capacity for long-termism. We get into what Jim Collins called the good to great leaders, which lines up very well with these research studies. This is about 10% of our leaders, which can go about 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years, which is wonderful. And then, which we're not going to get into too much, the leading edge, because we're not going to see a lot of leaders be moving into this. There's actually about 5% of leaders today test out at this, and the time horizon is a lifetime, multi-generations, and for anyone who wants to have a glass of wine tonight, we can talk about the top of it where time disappears as we understand it, and it goes into timeless time, and it's just eternity, and once again over a glass of wine. And so this concept here, what I want to leave you with is that the capacity to care and the capacity for long-termism, I just want to leave you with this. They're capacities. They're not simply choices. I love what Larry Fink said in his letter this year to the CEOs. The world needs your leadership. And I think it's very limiting because if they're operating at a conventional level with short-termism, we don't need more of their leadership at their current level. What the world needs is leaders to transform and to change, so that their change and transformation can then change and transform their businesses and ultimately the marketplace and ultimately the world. And so with that, my last slide, I invite you tomorrow. We talked about the exercise. It's not going to be a keynote as much as an interactive exercise. We're going to talk about the question of urgency, the fierce urgency of acting upon our call and this reformation. Why now? And why should we not wait? And why can we not wait? And so that's a little teaser for tomorrow. Look forward to being on the panel with the rest of the gang. And thank you guys very much for the opportunity to be here.